Hey everyone, you might not often think about how we make everyday assumptions about things that we see or experience. These assumptions we might call inferences. Like, think of this. If you saw a very elaborate toy Lego pirate ship on your back porch, you would likely assume that one of your kids or grandkids put it together, perhaps with the help of a parent. If you ask the question, who put together the Lego ship on the back porch, you would likely not accept the answer, well, nobody. We had several windstorms recently and the parts were left out and they just blew together on their own. You also would likely not accept the caveat, keep in mind those parts were back there for a really, really long time, and there have been many, many windstorms. Now, this is not the perfect analogy of what we're going to be looking at in upcoming segments, but it gives us a general framework for the question, why does the universe seem to be designed? Now, to backtrack, this is the third segment of a series that I'm calling A Defense of the Christian Faith, and I'm glad you have stuck with me this far. If you're new to apologetic studies, this can seem like drinking from a fire hose. I do want to reemphasize that this is Valley Baptist University. So hopefully there should be a built-in expectation that we'll be exploring some very heady subjects. Jesus said we are to love the Lord our God with all of our, including our minds. In fact, our own church's statement of faith under Article 12 for Christian education says, Christianity is the faith of enlightenment and intelligence. So this series I'm presenting represents an approach which is sometimes termed as classical Christian apologetics or defenses. It's an approach that builds on itself systematically, helping thinkers come to a faith that understanding in order to have a trust in belief. And we're looking at ways we can consider inferences to Christianity as objectively true, meaning inference to the best explanation. And we've looked at how, even though this is not divorced from inductive reasoning, this is formally sometimes called abductive reasoning. We are currently on the general subject of the existence of God as it pertains to what Christian authors describe as general revelation or natural theology. The Bible references this kind of thinking in Romans 1:19-20, where it says God's existence can be understood by the things that are made. We looked last time at just a basic question. Sometimes it's even in just secular philosophy. The question was, why is there something instead of nothing? And this lended itself to discussion about what's called the cosmological argumentation for the existence of God, meaning that the principle of causation teaches every finite thing is caused by something else or depends on something else for its existence. And since we have every indicator that the universe is finite, and most would even include has a beginning, we inferred the best explanation is that the universe was caused by something or someone else. Now, when we did that, we didn't get very far into what the attributes or character of this transcendent cause are, although I think I could have presented some solid inferences that could be made, but that would overlap with today's topic. So in today's topic, we take on this question, why does the universe seem designed or give the appearance of designed? In a formal sense, design arguments are called teleological arguments from the Greek word telos, meaning end or meaning fulfilling a goal or aim. Now, to summarize the late Dr. Norm Geisler, he describes it this way. I had an opportunity to hear him speak publicly and meet him a number of years ago. He says the major premise of this argument affirms that where there is design, there must be a designer. He calls the minor premise of the argument referring to the existence of design throughout the universe. So the conclusion of these premises is that there must be a universal designer. Another way of stating the argument is in a deductive manner using the following syllogism. Number one, all designs imply a designer. Number two, there is great design in the universe. Number three, therefore, there must be a great designer of the universe. Now, like we did in the last segment, I want to structure this session based on common pushbacks from opposing viewpoints. So one of these pushbacks would be this first question. Question number one. Well, who says it does appear designed? And that's a great question. I want to challenge you, if you do genuine research on this, you are going to find that at least this appearance of design is very much a mainstream position. The friction actually rests with what conclusions you might come to. Going back to one of the earliest proponents of this position, British astrophysicist Fred Hoyle, who was an atheist. He based his study purely on evidence and came to hold that a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics, as well as with chemistry and biology. Somebody responded to this, Owen Gingerich, a Harvard astronomy professor and senior astronomer of the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory. He said, Fred Hoyle and I differ on a lot of questions, but on this, he says, we agree. A common sense and satisfying interpretation of our world suggests the designing hand of a superintelligence. Now, these are statements that represent this position called intelligent design. Remember, previously we asked the question, why is there something instead of nothing, and inferred a transcendent cause. Now, based on design, we're inferring a cause that's not only transcendent, but also intelligent. And there are many who would hold to this, who even have a view of God that's much different than the biblical Christian God, but this remains an inferred position held by scientists, both Christian and non-Christian alike. One example is the respected cosmologist and physicist Paul Davies. He says, the impression of design is overwhelming. British astronomer Edward Harrison says the fine-tuning of the universe provides prima facie evidence of deistic design. The physicist Walter Bradley says evidence for an intelligent designer becomes more compelling the more we understand about our carefully crafted habitat. Astrophysicist Luke Barnes, in his book The Fine-Tuning of the Universe, even states there are countless scientists from numerous different persuasions. He gives a big list of them who accept this core premise that the universe is fine-tuned for life. Even numerous well-known skeptics like Richard Dawkins hold of this. But again, a number of them go from there to some different conclusions to the Christian worldview conclusion. In fact, Luke Barnes, a Christian, co-authored a book with an atheist, Garrett Lewis, and the book is called A Fortunate Universe, Life in a Finely Tuned Cosmos. And the book emphasizes that cosmological fine-tuning is not, I want to repeat, is not an obscure field in the outskirts of science, but is an active topic of research in mainstream physics. They researched the findings, as a matter of fact, of over 200 peer-reviewed papers. And they came to the conclusion, on the balance, the fine-tuning of the universe for life has stood up well under the scrutiny of physicists. They said together, only a handful of peer-reviewed papers have challenged the fine-tuning cases we've discussed in the book, and none defend the contention that most values and constants and initial conditions of nature will permit on their own the existence of life. So, question number one, who says it does appear designed? Well, most of mainstream science, cosmology, physics, only the fringe doesn't. So question number two, what does it even mean that the universe is fine-tuned? We've used that terminology a lot already. Though definitions might vary somewhat, here are a couple strong definitions. Physicist Robin Collins puts it this way. He describes it as the extraordinary balancing of the fundamental laws and parameters of physics and the initial conditions of the universe. Stephen Myers says this. He describes it as the parameters of the initial conditions of the universe and the laws of physics unexpectedly falling into a very narrow tolerance range where outside of which advantageous outcomes would become impossible. And by advantageous outcomes, he means specifically the outcome of life. Collins says this, our minds can barely comprehend the precision of some of them. He says, we end up with just the right conditions to sustain life. And he says the coincidences are simply too amazing to have been the result of happenstance. To put it in pop culture terminology, they sometimes refer to this as the Goldilocks universe. If you know the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, this one is too hot, this one is too cold, this one is just right. And that's the attitude about the cosmos, and specifically even Earth for life is the just right syndrome. In fact, even an atheist cosmologist, Martin Rees, wrote a book called Just Six Numbers, where he narrowed it down from all these parameters, but gave just six. That he says, if these are not correct and just right, we don't have life. He includes the relative strength of gravity, the strength of nuclear binding, the number of spatial dimensions that constitute a recipe for a universe. He says if any one of them were to be untuned, there would be no stars and no life. Philosopher and scholar that we've had here a couple times at our church, and I've had numerous conversations with him, Dr. J.P. Moreland. He writes, in the formation of the universe, the balance of matter to antimatter had to be accurate to 1 part in 10 billion for the universe to arise. Maybe even more so, cosmologist Luke Barnes describes how the cosmological constant is finely tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 120th power. Think about it this way, that is 1 part in 1 trillion, 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 trillion. Which makes us understand why someone like Robert Collins, in looking at this and comparing this to gravity, he says gravity has an incomprehensibly narrow range for life to exist. In fact, Collins uses this illustration. He says, think about a gravity setting being like an old-fashioned linear radio dial. But imagine this one expands all across the breadth of the universe in billions and billions and billions of 1-inch increments. Collins says if the dial was moved from just 1 inch from where it was currently set, the result would be catastrophic and the universe couldn't sustain life. Now, what we're focusing on here is a version of what's called the strong anthropic principle. And so pushback and skeptics will go to number 3. Question number 3 is, well, what about the weak anthropic principle? The weak anthropic principle can be described this way. It's like saying if the universe wasn't fine-tuned for life, well then we wouldn't be here to observe it, so no explanation is needed. A couple of heavy hitters have responded to this. One is Canadian philosopher John Leslie. He said, imagine this. He said, you're standing before a firing squad of 50 trained marksmen. All are aiming directly at your chest from a short distance, and you hear the order, ready, aim, fire, but you don't feel anything. You remove your blindfold, you're still alive, and not one bullet has hit you. Well, how would you explain that? Well, a skeptic could say, oh, well, sure, if they had shot you, you wouldn't even be here, but you're here to tell about it. You see, that wouldn't be acceptable as a response. It still demands an explanation. Was this rigged? Was it a stunt? Was it a setup Mock's execution like author Dostoevsky in Siberia? Here's another pushback from Oxford philosopher Richard Swinburne. He invites people to imagine a madman who kidnaps a victim and threatens to kill him unless the victim can randomly draw the ace of hearts from 10 different well-shuffled packs of cards. To the madman's astonishment, he draws all the required cards, and then the kidnapper lets him go free. When the victim later recounts the story to a police officer, she tells him haughtily, "Oh, well, it's hardly surprising you drew only the aces of hearts, for you would not be here if any other cards had been drawn." Well, that wouldn't be acceptable. It's like what Hoyle said about his finding of the universe, that someone has monkeyed with the physics. We would infer that someone has monkeyed with the cards. So many times, and even more often than not, people who have studied this will go to question number 4. Doesn't the multiverse hypothesis effectively counter this? The multiverse idea is called by Stephen Meyer the most popular game in town now on this conversation. The multiverse idea, simply put, is the postulation of billions and billions of universes to soften the probability issue that we've just presented. Now, if you really think about it and take a look at this, this is right off kind of a backhanded compliment, because this is actually reactionary to the fine-tuning dilemma. And I've had these actual conversations with people. Someone will say, well, that fine-tuning argument isn't convincing. That doesn't work to infer design. Oh, well, really? Well, yeah, and by the way, we're postulating billions and billions of universes to soften the probability factor. That's a lot of postulation work to counter an inference that doesn't mean anything. In fact, physicist Clifford Longley says the sight of scientific atheists clutching at such desperate straws has put new spring in the step of theists. Now, there are different kinds of multiverse ideas. There's inflationary multiverse, there's string theory multiverse. Without getting into all the details of these, they require holding to or postulating a universe-generating mechanism, maybe even more than one. The Canadian philosopher of physics, Bruce Gordon, points out that to accept the multiverse hypothesis, a person has to accept 2 distinct types of universe-generating mechanisms for 2 different types of fine-tuning. One for the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe, the other for the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics. He describes this position as bloated, or essence of being ontologically bloated. He said this posits countless extraordinary numbers of purely hypothetical and abstract entities for which we have no direct evidence. Think about it. This is the sort of things that many of the same scientists would say that they are trying to avoid. In fact, Bruce Gordon presents all kinds of things that you would have to assert without evidence that exists in order to hold to this multiverse hypothesis. Here are just some of them. Here are 6. You'd have to believe in it that an inflation field exists. Number 2, that the decay of inflation fields will produce new bubble universes with different initial conditions. You'd have to believe, number 3, the process of inflation will continue eternally into the future. Number 4, that an infinite number of bubble universes exist or will eventually exist. Number 5, that unimaginably small vibrating strings of energy exist. 6 or 7 extra hidden spatial dimensions exist. And not only that, you would also have to hold to this assumption that there is a near infinite number of undetectable parallel universes. Yes, like in Doctor Strange. In fact, cosmologists Garriga and Vilenkin state that in an infinite multiverse, there are infinitely many regions where Al Gore is president, and yes, where Elvis is still alive. Now kind of put that on your pipe and puff on it a few times. You silly Christians, you hold that there is an eternal, metaphysical, intelligent cause? Well, what's your view of cosmology and fine-tuning? Oh, there are infinite parallel universes in which, for many of them, Elvis is still alive. It's no wonder Stephen Meyer says that some leading physicists have told him in all candor that they regard the multiverse hypothesis as a speculative, metaphysical, not physical, metaphysical hypothesis, not a scientific one. Greg Easterbrook, who's no friend of Christianity, points out the double standard. He said the multiverse idea rests on assumptions that would be laughed out of town if they came from a religious text. But even still, think about this. The multiverse hypothesis doesn't discount the case for design. Because whichever multiverse theory you use, in every case you need a many universes generator, and it would require the right structure, the right mechanism, the right ingredients to churn out these new universes. Stephen Meyer puts it this way. He references the proverbial monkey with the typewriters. So long as a monkey has long enough time, if he bangs on a typewriter, he will end up with Shakespeare's Hamlet. Meyer says the problem is, how do we account for the typewriter? The typewriter assumes design. Philosopher of physics Collins says, we have no experience of anything like inflation fields with precisely calibrated shutoff energies or string landscapes of compactified extra-dimensional spaces. Yet what do we have? We do have extensive experience of intelligent agents producing finely tuned systems such as Swiss watches, fine recipes, integrated circuits, written texts, and computer programs. So, according to Collins, postulating a supermind to explain the fine-tuning of the universe is a natural extrapolation from our experience-based knowledge of the causal powers of human intelligent agents. Question number 5. Now, people will say that, and I hear this often. Okay, but we've all read Carl Sagan and others. Isn't the Earth just an insignificant speck in the grand scheme of the cosmos? I mean, since the cosmos is so vastly big and the Earth is just so tiny, as Carl Sagan puts it, the pale blue dot, how can the universe be designed or intelligently designed? That's a bad use of space. Right off, when I read people who adhere to this way of thinking, it seems to be reflective of an assumed perspective. We talk a lot in our time about not being racist or sexist. Why are we such sizes about this subject? It's as if a value premium goes up or down based on physical size. There's an even old fictitious philosopher named Yoda who said size matters not. Even Dr. Seuss's Horton Hears a Who gives us an understanding of this. I want to say a couple things about this. Letter A, don't assume modern location values existed in other periods of history. We use this expression that you just want to be the center of your own universe. That's a modern expression. And to read that into all times of history is what's called an anachronism. I want to give you just a bit of a side story. There are numerous myths that have been passed down from generation to generation on this subject of the battle of religion versus science. In fact, statements from this narrative get passed down without footnotes as to where these even came from. Several historians, one Rodney Stark from the University of Washington and then Baylor, he's done extensive work on this and traced and documented this going back to primarily two authors from the Enlightenment era who had an agenda. One was Andrew Dickson White, who wrote a history of the warfare of science with theology and Christendom. As it turns out, if you do your research on this, a big chunk of what has been passed down to this is shown to be without documentation and either misleading or completely fabricated. What are some of these myths? One is Columbus and the flat earth. We've all been taught that Columbus was going to prove that the earth is round, and the Catholic Church told him, no, it's flat. But then that's actually a big myth. Virtually everybody in Columbus' era thought that the earth was a globe, and Columbus was not seeking to prove flat earth wrong. In fact, there are even images of medieval globes that appear in textbooks of higher learning from roughly the time of Columbus sailing. Here's another myth, the myth of the circumstance of Galileo. Now, some things that happened to Galileo were unfortunate, but there's an early 90s duo called the Indigo Girls. I kind of like some of their music. I used to listen to that. But one of their songs goes like this at the beginning. Galileo's head was on the chopping block. His crime was looking up the truth. Actually, if you look up the truth, here's the truth. Galileo's head was never on the chopping block. And number two, his crime was actually insulting the Pope. The Pope had said that since there are still divergent views about the heliocentric universe, he said, call this a hypothesis and not a fact. Galileo didn't, and then he directly insulted the Pope. Now, I'm not Catholic, so I don't have a dog in this fight, but we got to get to the truth of these things. Alfred North Whitehead, the historian, said Galileo actually suffered an honorable detention and a mild reproof before dying peaceably in his bed. We've been taught that Galileo's predecessor, Copernicus, was put to death. He was actually persecuted and died of natural causes the same year that his ideas were published. But here's another myth of theology versus science. This myth is that Christians wanted or needed the earth to be the center of the universe. Once again, this is a myth and even an anachronism. In the Enlightenment era, this narrative was created that the church, because of its arrogance, needed to put humans at the center of the universe. And yet, all you have to do is go to Dante's Divine Comedy. You find out that the earth is not so much at the center, but at the bottom of the universe. And Galileo was a believer, as well as Copernicus, a professing Christ follower, and he was not intentionally depreciating the earth. He said the earth reflects the glory of the sun and now is no longer in a cosmic sump. Again, the point of this is don't assume modern location values are expressions that existed in other periods of history. Okay, that's letter A. But letter B, even still, humans are actually not tiny in the grand scheme that factors in both outer space and inner space. From the book The Privileged Planet, astronomer Guillermo Gonzalez points out that in comparison to the farthest reaches of known outer space and the farthest reaches of the molecular world, the known inner space, the size of humans is actually roughly right at the center. Now, letter C, think about this. Evidence suggests that the Earth's positioning is actually one of privilege. Again, noted in the book Privileged Planet, co-authored by Guillermo Gonzalez and Jay Richards. Richards says this Copernican principle, which is the idea that we're going to get the earth out of the center of the universe and all that arrogance, and they named that after Copernicus. That wasn't his attitude. But Richard says this Copernican principle is just describing properties that don't matter. Why do we care if we're in the physical center of the galaxy? What really matters is being in the place that's most conducive to life, and that's exactly where the Earth finds itself. Not only that, we find the Earth at the place positioned for discovery. And Gonzalez builds on this. He says, we've found that our location in the universe, in our galaxy, in our solar system, as well as such things as the size and rotation of the Earth, the mass of the moon and the sun, the whole range of factors conspire together in an amazing way to make Earth a habitable planet and also poised to discover the universe. Physicist Freeman Dyson went so far as to make this remarkable statement. He says, looking at the universe and noticing the many so-called accidents of physics and astronomy that have worked together for our benefit, he says it almost seems as if the universe must in some sense have known we were coming. In their book, The Story or the New Story of Science, Ogris and Stanchu sum up the inferences which can be made about these coincidences that make life possible. And they describe it as a universe aiming at the production of man, which implies a mind directing it. Though man is not at the physical center of the universe, he appears to be at the center of its purpose. Now, I want to step back and remind people a biblical worldview doesn't hold that the world and universe is without defect. I used to love listening to Christopher Hitchens say, you realize that this earth is going to go up in fervent heat. The earth is coming to an end. I want to sit there and go, Mr. Hitchens, are you that biblically illiterate? That's what 2 Peter says in the Bible. So the earth says the world has a beginning, and science supports that. By inference, the world says that the earth has an ending, as he just said. Science actually supports that. And the world says the beginning seems to be designed, and the Bible supports that as far as having an intelligent designer. And so a biblical view is not that the world is without defect, but it is extraordinarily situated for habitability and discovery. Think about this. Arno Penzias, a physics Nobel laureate, speaks of how the conviction that there is a teleological, a design dimension in the universe goes back thousands of years. He writes that the best data we have are exactly what I would have predicted had I nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. John Lennox says, we notice in passing Penzias' use of the word predicted. He says, here's another example or a major counterexample of the commonly held notion that there is no element of predictability and thus no scientific dimension in the theistic account of creation. Now, keep in mind, these are not the only arguments that most thinkers rest on who end up holding to a belief that a creator God exists. These are not the only arguments by a long shot. I mean, we did look previously at cosmological arguments, and these are not even the only arguments for design. In our next segment, we're going to look at the subjects of tiny machines and consciousness. But for now, I want you to think about the story of Patrick Glenn. Patrick Glenn was a student at both Harvard and Cambridge, and he progressively grew as a stronger and stronger atheist, but then he took an about-face. And he ended up turning away from his atheism and became a believer in God. And he ended up writing the book, God, the Evidence. And guess what he cited? He cited the anthropic principle and fine-tuning of the cosmos as being among the key reasons why he concluded that the universe must have been the handiwork of a master designer. And so I ask the question to you, as a thinker. You probably wouldn't even be watching this if you weren't somebody who wanted to be someone who thought deeply. I encourage you to explore this and to keep exploring with me here at VBU as we build progressively on the implications of this for a worldview and for life. And I will see you on the next segment of A Defense of Christian Belief here at VBU.